Thanks very much to Dmitry and to Dan and everyone from the Moscow Center for organizing this really wonderful workshop and cruise, which is a fantastic thing for all of us. So, spasiba. That's all the Russian I know. I'm sorry. And and spasiba to Jesse too for writing this this wonderful book and providing us with so much interesting material to talk about, of which I'm only today going to be able to talk about a very small fraction, chapter 2 on the intermediate level hypothesis. There's an extraordinary amount of more rich integration of neuroscience and philosophy in his in the book, but for reasons of time I'll concentrate there. I've noticed that so far the speaker commentary pairings seem to be very much pairings of fellow travelers. So, you know, Dan's very sympathetic commentary on Dirk, and Nick's very sympathetic commentary on Paul. I don't know to what extent this is intended. I guess Jesse and I do disagree on a fair number of things, although I think there's at least one sense in which we're fellow travelers with respect to this conference. And that
we're on the boat together?
What's that? Yeah. Yeah, in that particular sense.
We're all on the same boat.
Yeah. It's been noted that, you know, there are many people at this workshop who are sympathetic with the idea that consciousness involves some kind of illusion. To the sense, I think one could even think of this as a central focus, perhaps the central focus that we'll be discussing. I like to think about this as the illusion cruise to really work through this view. I mean, but I think of all the people on the cruise, maybe Jesse and I are at least among the main speakers, the least sympathetic with this view. I mean, as far as I can tell, Jesse's views about consciousness are very robustly realist about the phenomenon, about phenomenology in general. To be sure, they're reductionist and materialist, but they don't show much signs of convicting us of the kind of illusion or introspective error that many of the other people here are exploring. And this comes out in the fact that Jesse takes very seriously many questions about the extent, about the precise character, the precise nature of phenomenology and phenomenal character. I mean, to a large extent, his views about the intermediate level and about attention are views about the extent of phenomenology. I mean, these get presented as accounts of the processing basis of consciousness. So to some extent, you might think of this as kind of a subpersonal, scientific account of the correlates or the realizers or the constituents of consciousness. But these go along very centrally with views about the extent of phenomenology. That is, about what are we conscious of. And, you know, there are many debates about the extent of phenomenology in the recent literature. Even to restrict it to the visual case, there are many debates about this. Are we just conscious of relatively low-level things like colors and shapes and motion and so on? Or are we also visually conscious of sort of high-level categories like being a cup or being Paul Churchland? Is there some sort of visual representation of cupness or of Polishness in my phenomenology? It's a very central part of my phenomenology. Some people say yes, some people say no. Jesse says no. Likewise with debates about consciousness and attention. There's a debate about whether the phenomenal character, about whether what's in visual consciousness is restricted to what's within visual attention, or does it go beyond what's in visual attention? Are we conscious of things outside the limits of attention? Some people say yes, that we've got a rich consciousness that goes well beyond what we attend to. Jesse says no. So it's interesting actually in both of these cases and in many other cases besides, Jesse, although realist about consciousness, tends to the very robustly realist about the basic phenomenon, is nonetheless leans towards an austere view of its contents. So Jesse's own, you know, phenomenal consciousness is the austere consciousness of colors and shapes and motion and so on, limited to the bounds of attention, which can be contrasted with people on the other side of these issues who think, no, that in fact we're visually conscious of all these high-level categories like being a fork and being a cup and being Paul, and far beyond the bounds of attention. So it's certainly on the austere side of things. Now it's interesting. Actually, it's an interesting side question to what extent an illusionist about consciousness would think we ought to take these debates seriously. I mean, this is presuming there are sort of facts of the matter about the extent of phenomenal character. Is it confined to attention? Does it go beyond attention? Is it low level or is it high level? I mean, if someone's illusionist enough, I think there's no such thing as phenomenology, and I say it's a ridiculous debate. Those people who want to deflate the facts about consciousness, for example, to things about the judgments we make and the ways we represent it, might say, oh, well, that's going to be a fairly superficial question about what the kind of features we're inclined to judge our consciousness as having. It's actually, this is more of a question for Dan's session, exactly how Dan reconciles his own version of illusionism with taking seriously the Jackendorf question about the intermediate level theory of consciousness. Can there really be an answer to that question of whether it's just the intermediate level stuff or the high level stuff if you take the heavily deflationary view? But anyway, Jesse's background assumptions are realist, and he goes for the austere view about phenomenology in almost every case where there's a choice. I mean, it also comes up in debates about, is there cognitive phenomenology, a non-sensory phenomenology of thinking? Jesse says no, just the sensory stuff. Is there a non-bodily, non-sensory component of emotional phenomenology? Jesse says no. So in every case, he goes in the direction of the austere view. So that's the view about phenomenology. And there's a correlative view about the science, about the processing correlates or constituents of consciousness, which is the intermediate level view. And Jesse presents the intermediate level view in his chapter 2 of his book, as being very much driven by the science, in particular by the contemporary neuroscience of vision. And from there, it looks like you might read it as there's an argument from the science to the intermediate level view of consciousness, and from there to a conclusion about the phenomenology. So we're getting this debate about the phenomenology settled by discoveries, in particular in visual neuroscience. I guess all I want to do is to raise the question as to whether that's really the direction of support is. There's a view about the science and the correlates of consciousness. There's a view about the phenomenology. And the question is, which one is really in the driver's seat for Jesse? Is it the phenomenology driving the conclusions about the science, or is it the science driving the conclusions about the phenomenology? And my suspicion is that it may actually be the other way around, that Jesse's views about the phenomenology are driving his interpretation of the science. I mean, to get at that, one needs to look at the arguments he gives for the intermediate level view in the chapter he sent us. And I mean, Jesse presents the intermediate level view as competing with two other views. One is the low level view, where we're conscious of things corresponding to extremely primitive elements, say in visual processing, and the high level view, where we're conscious of just things like the semantic categories, being a cat and being a cup and so on. But I take it in practice, the main competitor for the intermediate level view is neither the low level view nor the high level view. I mean, I think not many people seem to embrace a view where we're conscious of stuff lower level than the intermediate level features of phenomenology we talked about. I mean, there are some people who think neural correlates of consciousness are at least partly in V1. We could talk about that. The main competitor seems to be a view where we are in fact conscious of some high level features, such as being a cup and being a pole, being Paul, and so on. People who hold that view don't deny that we're also conscious of the features like color and shape and so on. But the question is whether we're conscious in addition of the relevant high-level features. So in a way, at least the phenomenological debate is between the people who think we're conscious just of what Jesse thinks of as the intermediate features, the colors, shapes, motion, and we're conscious of those, and also conscious of high-level features, such as being a cup and being a table and so on. From that perspective, then the question is, okay, what are Jesse's arguments for the intermediate-only view against the thesis that consciousness includes consciousness of some high-level features? And the main arguments that he gives here are arguments from brain injury, various kinds of brain damage, where he says, look at what we find here. When you get damage to intermediate level areas, then you get consciousness is wiped out. When you get damage to relevant high-level areas, consciousness is more or less unaffected. Therefore, that's good reason to think our consciousness is of the intermediate level stuff, but not of the high-level stuff. Now, it's worth looking at those arguments through the lens of what the alternative view would predict. The view that, yeah, we have consciousness at both levels of the colors and shapes and the chairs and tables. I mean, on most of those views, the consciousness of chairs and tables will be causally dependent on consciousness of shapes and colors and so on. So from that perspective, it's not a huge surprise that knocking out the consciousness of the visual consciousness of colors and shapes and motion and so on would also knock out your consciousness of cups and tables, your visual consciousness of cups and tables and so on. So it's not clear that that fact carries huge evidential weight in favor of the intermediate view. As for the other direction, that when you knock out relevant high-level areas of visual processing, consciousness is unaffected. Well, it seems to me that many opponents of many of the people who embrace the idea that we're conscious of high-level features are simply going to deny this claim and take it as begging certain questions against them. They're going to say that when you've got various forms, for example, of visual agnosia, where you don't recognize various objects, your visual consciousness is massively affected. It's phenomenologically very, very different from the way it was when you didn't have that kind of agnosia. You're merely conscious of some weird shapes out there, but in not recognizing it as a cup or a table, in not recognizing Paul, the visual phenomenological world is very different from what it was beforehand. Well, I'm just articulating a view here. This is what the view will be. What is Jesse's argument? That it's not this way. Well, Jesse's argument, as far as I can tell in the section, is, well, no, your visual consciousness is unaffected. People can draw all the stuff that they were that's present to them. They recognize colors and shapes and so on, and they experience colors and shapes in much the same way. And that's to say, it looks like the intermediate level features of phenomenology are preserved. As far as I can tell, there's no argument that the phenomenology is the same simpliciter. You might say, well, if we could take for granted that all there was in consciousness was the low-level stuff, the colors, the shapes, the motion, then this would show that consciousness is unaffected. If you don't assume that, then many people take it as people who embrace the high-level view will take it as pretty obvious that consciousness is heavily affected by doing this. So the question is, how do we adjudicate between those views? It's later in the chapter in addressing objections that Jesse's own take on all this comes out, when he addresses the objection that for many people who take it as phenomenologically obvious that we're perceptually presented with these high-level categories, both in the analytic tradition and the phenomenological tradition, this is taken as very centrally obvious. Heidegger says when you hear the car crash, you're not getting a bunch of noises. You're hearing the metal on metal. You're hearing cars. It's all very your auditory phenomenology is heavily semantic through and through. Jesse says, well, when I examine my phenomenology, I don't find any of this. All I find is the colors and the shapes. In fact, he goes to the extreme of even contrasting the ellipse, the case of the tilted coin, where some people say they find a circle, other people think there's just phenomenology of an ellipse. And Jesse says, well, when I examine my phenomenology, all I find is the ellipse. I don't find any traces of a circle. And I think it's an honest and sincere report of his phenomenology, which he's using as the basis to answer this objection. But at this point, I start to wonder now whether that's, in examining the dialectic of the chapter as a whole, whether it starts to look like this particular view, this particular introspective view that Jesse has about his own phenomenology, and on the basis of that, a view about the phenomenology of others, is actually doing the work. yes, I examine my phenomenology. All I find is the low-level things. This then provides the driver for the argument that when we find people with damage to high-level processing areas, their consciousness is unaffected. Well, given Jesse's take on the phenomenology, that would be the right thing to say. Given a different view of the phenomenology, that would be the wrong thing to say. So I guess the fairly limited point that I want to make here then is that it starts to seem to me that what's actually doing the work in Jesse's argument for the intermediate level view is not a bunch of stuff about the empirical results. The empirical results can be interpreted through the lens of the intermediate level view or the intermediate plus high level view. And as far as I can tell, there's very little there in the chapter that's really decisive between them. What's doing the work for Jesse is his own view of the phenomenology. And whether that view of the phenomenology based on introspection is right or wrong is a very difficult one on which I don't have a strong view. I do lean towards the view that the high level stuff is present in the phenomenology, but I don't think there's a absolutely decisive argument for it. Many of these issues actually recur for the discussion of whether consciousness outstrips attention and what's doing the driving work there. Jesse and I have been back and forth on that before, so I won't go through that again now. But anyway, I'm probably used up my time now, so maybe I'll just hand over to Jesse to get his thoughts on these issues. Thanks.